Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you'd like to submit a story, feel free to do so in the comments down below or on my email. Alright, now let's dive into today's story. It all started as a joke. Isn't that how these things always start? You think it's all fun and games until suddenly it's not. Looking back, I can see all the little warning signs we ignored. But in the moment, we were just a group of friends, out for a good time. I guess we were asking for it. Last summer, my friends and I decided to get away from it all. There were 5 of us: me, Eric, Ryan, Mia, and Jess. We crammed into Eric's rusty old SUV, which groaned under the weight of our camping gear, snacks, and an ambitious supply of cheap beer. The plan was simple: find a remote cabin, disconnect from the world, and have the kind of carefree weekend we'd all been craving. The drive out was half the fun. Ryan, the self-appointed class clown of the group, kept us entertained with terrible jokes and exaggerated impressions of every bad horror movie villain you could think of. Eric, ever the responsible one, kept rolling his eyes but couldn't hide his grin. Mia and Jess sat in the back seat, alternating between singing along to the radio and teasing Ryan for his antics. As for me, I was just happy to be there, soaking in the easy camaraderie that made everything feel lighter, even under the blistering summer sun. The cabin we rented was as remote as they come. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was a good mile down the road. It was perfect, a small wooden structure nestled in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets to one another in the wind. At night, the stars were so bright and close that it felt like you could reach out and touch them. We spent the first evening laughing around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories we all pretended weren't creepy. The trouble started on our second day. We decided to go for a hike, aiming to explore the woods, and maybe find the lake we'd heard about from the cabin's owner. The trail was overgrown but easy enough to follow, winding through groves of ancient trees and patches of wildflowers that seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a painting. Ryan, of course, couldn't resist straying off the path whenever he thought he'd found something interesting. It was one of those detours that led us to the graveyard. The place appeared out of nowhere, like it had been waiting for us. One moment, we were surrounded by the endless green of the forest, and the next, we were standing in a clearing filled with crumbling tombstones. The air felt different there, heavier, colder, and eerily silent. Even the birds, which had been chirping non-stop, seemed to have vanished. "Whoa," Mia said, breaking the silence. "This is creepy." "Nah, it's awesome," Ryan said, grinning. "We've officially found the set of every horror movie ever made." The tombstones were old, some so weathered that the names and dates were barely legible. A few were tilted at odd angles, as though the earth beneath them was trying to reclaim them. But one grave stood out. The stone was clean, its lettering sharp and clear, as if it had been carved yesterday. It read, "Here lies Thomas Whitaker, who laughed himself to death." Ryan burst out laughing. "Are you kidding me? That's real? Someone actually wrote that?" He bent over, clutching his sides as he exaggerated his laughter. What was he laughing at? The bill for this gravestone? I couldn't help it. I laughed too. We all did. It was absurd, and in the middle of that eerie graveyard, absurdity felt like a welcome relief. Mia pulled out her phone to snap a picture of the stone while Eric and Jess joined in, posing dramatically next to it, as if they were reenacting poor Thomas Whitaker's final moments. But Ryan, of course, had to take it further. He threw himself onto the ground, clutching his sides and gasping for breath like he was in the throes of some comedic fit. "Oh no," he cried. "It's happening. Someone save me. I'm laughing myself to death." That's when we noticed the old man. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, so silently that none of us saw him approach. He was tall and wiry, with skin like aged leather and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His clothes were plain, a worn flannel shirt and dusty jeans. But there was something about him that made my skin crawl. "Show respect for the dead," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Do not laugh at their fate." We froze. His words hung in the air like a physical weight, and for a moment no one moved. Then Ryan, ever the fearless idiot, broke the tension. "Come on, man," he said, still grinning. "It's just a joke." The old man didn't respond. He just stared at us, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he shook his head, then turned and disappeared back into the trees as silently as he'd come. We stood there for a moment, the laughter gone, replaced by a heavy, uneasy silence. I glanced at Ryan, expecting him to crack another joke, but even he looked a little shaken. Still, as we left the graveyard and made our way back to the cabin, we brushed it off. It was just a weird encounter, we told ourselves. Nothing to worry about. We should have listened. We didn't talk much on the way back to the cabin. The energy we'd had earlier, the jokes, the laughter, was gone, replaced by an awkward silence. Even Ryan was quiet, which was rare enough to be unsettling. The only sounds came from the forest, the occasional rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the trail. It wasn't oppressive, but it wasn't comfortable either. None of us wanted to admit that the old man had gotten under our skin. Even Ryan, usually the first to brush things off, seemed a little less sure of himself. The cabin came into view just as the sun dipped below the treetops, casting the clearing into deep shadow. Its wooden facade, charmingly rustic during the day, now looked weathered and cold. We dumped our gear on the porch, a little more hurried than usual, and filed inside without a word. It wasn't until we were sitting around the fire pit later that night, beers in hand, that the mood started to lighten. Eric threw another log on the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "All right," he said, breaking the silence. "We need to forget about that creepy guy. Let's make this trip fun again. Who's got a good ghost story?" Mia groaned. "Seriously? After what happened today, you want to tell ghost stories?" "Come on, Mia," Ryan said, his grin making a comeback. "Don't tell me the old man spooked you. He was just some cranky local trying to scare us off. Probably gets his kicks freaking out tourists." Jess nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Yeah, he was creepy, but it's not like he's following us or anything." That was enough to get everyone talking again. One by one, we shared the worst, cheesiest ghost stories we could think of, trying to outdo each other with exaggerated scares and bad impressions of creepy voices. Ryan leaned into the role of showman, adding theatrical flair to every story. By the time we got to his turn, we were all laughing again, the tension from the graveyard slowly ebbing away. All right," Ryan said, raising his hands as if to quiet a roaring crowd. "I've got a good one. It's about this guy, Thomas Whitaker. Heard of him? Mia groaned again, but the rest of us laughed. Ryan stood up, adopting a dramatic tone as he gestured at the firelight. Thomas Whitaker, who laughed himself to death. Legend says he's still out there, wandering the woods, looking for people to share the joke with. But if you hear his laugh... Before he could finish, we heard it. A faint laugh, so quiet we almost missed it. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that we all froze. "Very funny, Ryan," Jess said, rolling her eyes, but her voice was unsteady. "You can stop now." "It's not me," Ryan said, holding up his hands. His grin faltered. "I swear." The laugh came again, louder this time. It was slow and wheezy, like someone struggling to breathe between chuckles. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Eric, who was staring into the darkness, his jaw tight. "Maybe it's a coyote," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. "They make weird noises sometimes." "Coyotes don't laugh," Mia whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but her words carried an edge of fear that made my stomach tighten. For a few minutes we just sat there, listening. The laughter circled us, moving through the trees. It wasn't constant. It would start and stop, like whoever, or whatever, was laughing wanted to keep us guessing. At one point it sounded like it was right behind me. My heart slammed against my ribs as I whipped around, my eyes searching the shadows. There was nothing there, just darkness. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Jess said, her voice shaking. "Let's go inside." We didn't argue. Eric stomped out the fire, his movements quick and tense, and we hurried back to the cabin, locking the doors behind us. Once inside, we tried to laugh it off. "It's just some animal," Eric said, forcing a smile. "Or maybe there's a campground nearby. Could have been other hikers messing with us." But we all knew it wasn't true. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't human either. Not exactly. And it definitely wasn't over. That night, as we tried to sleep, the laughter came back. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again, louder now and more distorted. It didn't sound like it was outside anymore. It seemed to echo off the walls of the cabin, coming from every direction at once. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as the sound grew closer and closer. I could hear Ryan shifting in the bed across the room, muttering something under his breath. Jess let out a nervous laugh from her room, but it sounded forced. None of us wanted to admit we were scared. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't just a prank or a coincidence. Something was out there. Something was watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we woke to find Ryan's bed empty. At first, none of us were particularly alarmed. Ryan had a habit of wandering off early, usually in search of some stupid way to entertain himself. The man practically thrived on being unpredictable. I figured he'd gone outside to set up some elaborate prank, or maybe he just needed some time to cool off after last night. But when we stepped outside, calling his name, the usual joking atmosphere was missing. The morning air was heavy, damp from a night of dew, and the forest seemed eerily still, No bird song, no rustling leaves, just silence. The soundlessness made every Ryan echo back at us like a taunt. Maybe he went down to the lake, Eric suggested, slinging his jacket over his shoulder. He's probably just trying to freak us out. Jess frowned. His phone's still on his bed. Ryan doesn't go anywhere without his phone. Mia nodded, chewing her lip. That's what's weirding me out. He's probably messing with us but leaving his phone. That's not like him. Despite the gnawing unease settling in my chest, I tried to play along with Eric's logic. Let's check the lake, I said. Worst case, he's hiding in the trees waiting to jump out and scare us. If we play along, maybe he'll get bored and stop. The trail to the lake was narrow, lined with gnarled roots that seemed to reach out for our ankles as we walked. The sun had climbed higher now, but the thick canopy overhead cast the woods in shadow, making everything feel colder than it should have been. Every so often, someone would call Ryan's name, their voice cutting through the stillness before fading into the trees. Each unanswered shout only made the silence feel more oppressive. When we reached the lake, it was as still as glass. No ripples, no signs of anyone's presence. We spread out, checking the shore and peering into the dense brush surrounding the water, but there was nothing. No tracks, no stray beer cans, not even a broken branch to suggest anyone had been there at all. Ryan was gone. By the time we got back to the cabin, the tension in the group was palpable. Eric was trying his best to stay optimistic, throwing out theories that got less convincing with every sentence. Maybe he doubled back and went to the main road, he said. I mean, he's probably trying to hitch a ride into town, get a signal, and call someone. Then why wouldn't he just tell us? Mia snapped. Why'd he leave his phone? Why'd he leave everything? He wouldn't, Jess said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the certainty in it sent a chill through me. We spent the next few hours searching the surrounding woods, venturing further than we had that morning. I'll admit, my optimism began to crumble the longer we looked. Every tree started to look the same, their trunks stretching endlessly into the forest like they were multiplying just to mock us. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the fear we'd all been pushing down was finally bubbling to the surface. Back at the cabin, we sat around the dining table, the atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. Mia hugged her knees to her chest, staring blankly at the floor. Jess kept her arms crossed tightly, her nails digging into her sleeves. Eric had his head in his hands, muttering something to himself that none of us could hear. Then, as if on cue, a sound broke the silence, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating. We all froze. Slowly, we turned toward the noise, which was coming from the living room. Mia was the first to move, creeping toward the sound with hesitant steps. It was coming from Ryan's phone, which was lying on the coffee table where none of us had left it. The screen was cracked, but it was lit up, the gallery app open to his photos. That's not funny, Mia said, her voice shaking as she picked up the phone. Who put this here? None of us touched it, I said. I swear. She stared at the screen for a moment before her face went pale. Oh my God, she whispered, holding the phone out for us to see. The last photo in the gallery wasn't one any of us had taken. It showed Ryan lying on the cabin floor, his face frozen in a wide, unnatural grin. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, staring at something just beyond the camera. His body looked limp, his arms and legs splayed out like a discarded doll. But what made the picture even worse was the way the light hit his face, like it was mocking us, daring us to laugh. Jess let out a choked sob, backing away from the phone as if it had burned her. Eric swore under his breath, grabbing the phone and scrolling through the gallery as if he'd find some kind of explanation hidden there. But there was nothing else. Just that one photo, time-stamped for a time when we'd all been out looking for him. "It's fake," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It has to be. Someone's screwing with us." "Who?" Mia snapped. "Who would do this?" Before Eric could answer, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then the cabin was plunged into darkness. And that's when we heard it again. The laughter. Slow, wheezy, and unmistakable, it echoed through the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't Ryan. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. A wheezy, unnatural sound that twisted my insides with every breathy chuckle. My legs were locked in place, my body frozen by the sheer wrongness of it. I could hear Jess sobbing quietly behind me and Eric muttering under his breath, a steady stream of curses mixed with panicked breaths. Mia's hand clutched my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin, but I didn't dare move. "It's inside," Eric whispered finally, his voice trembling. I wanted to argue, to say it couldn't be, but I knew he was right. The sound wasn't muffled, wasn't outside the cabin walls. It was here with us, reverberating through the air like the hum of a fluorescent light gone haywire. Mia broke the silence. "We have to leave." "And go where?" Eric snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "The car's a mile away, and that thing, whatever it is out there too." "We can't just stay here," Mia shot back, her voice cracking. "You heard it, Eric. You saw the photo. Ryan, he..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jess let out a shaky breath. "What if it's not just Ryan? What if it's something else?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words hung heavy in the air. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw. The laughter stopped suddenly, cutting off mid-chuckle as if someone had flipped a switch. For a moment, the silence felt like a reprieve, but then it stretched on too long, too quiet, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. That's when we heard the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. We all jumped, and Jess let out a stifled scream. I turned toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be Ryan. We all knew that. But the alternative was something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the sound of another 3 knocks, each one echoing through the cabin like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. "Don't open it," Mia said, clutching my arm tighter. "Whatever you do, don't open it." Eric grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, holding it in front of him like a sword. "If it gets in here, we're not sitting ducks. We fight." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't something we could fight, but the words died in my throat. The knocks stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling, like something heavy was being dragged along the porch. They circled the cabin, each step scraping against the wooden boards, getting closer to the windows. And then a voice, Ryan's voice. "Hey guys, open the door," it said, calm and casual, like he was asking for a drink of water. "Come on, it's freezing out here." Jess started shaking her head, whispering, "Oh no." Mia's grip on my arm tightened. "That's not him," she hissed. "It can't be." "Let me in," the voice said again. It sounded exactly like Ryan, but there was something off. Too smooth, too perfect, like a recording played back on a loop. The footsteps stopped outside the window nearest to Jess. She shrieked and scrambled away as a shadow passed over the curtain, tall and thin, almost impossibly so. The voice came again, closer this time. "Guys, what's wrong? Don't you recognize me?" The shadow lingered by the window, unmoving. It stretched upward, the faint outline of it grotesque in its proportions, the head too narrow, the arms too long. It bent slightly, as if peering inside, and for one terrible moment, I thought it might press its face against the glass. The laughter started again, low and wheezy, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside found the whole situation hysterical. The sound of shuffling returned, moving away from the window. I moved instinctively, pulling Jess further into the corner as the shadow disappeared into the darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by that oppressive silence once more. We didn't speak for a long time. None of us knew what to say. Eric eventually lowered the fire poker, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Mia sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, while Jess rocked back and forth, her eyes wide and unblinking. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Only 2 a.m. Morning felt a lifetime away, and the thought of enduring hours of this was unbearable. I paced the room, trying to think of something, anything that could help. "We need to get out of here," I said, finally breaking the silence. "First light. We head to the car and don't look back." No one argued, but the doubt in their faces was clear. The cabin felt like a cage now, the walls too close, the shadows too dark. Even with the fire poker, even with our resolve, we knew deep down that whatever was out there wasn't something we could fight. Morning was our only hope. Mia spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it doesn't wait until morning? What if it comes back?" Eric sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Then we stick together. No one goes anywhere alone. We keep the lights on and we wait." Jess finally looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked. "And if it gets in?" None of us had an answer for that. The unspoken truth settled over us like a heavy blanket. If it got in, there was nothing we could do. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the weight of fear pressing down on us. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made us jump. And all the while the question lingered in my mind. What if it was already inside? The minutes crawled by like hours, every tick of the clock a cruel reminder of how far we were from dawn. The cabin had grown unbearably quiet, save for the faint crackling of the dying fire. None of us dared to move too far from one another. Eric kept his grip on the fire poker, his knuckles stark white against the dim light. Mia sat on the couch, rocking slightly as if to soothe herself, while Jess kept her knees tucked to her chest, her wide eyes darting to every shadow. I kept pacing, the knot of anxiety in my stomach tightening with every creak of the wooden floor. My thoughts spun in circles, trying to make sense of what we had seen, what we had heard. The photo of Ryan, the voice at the door, the shadow by the window. None of it fit together in any rational way. "It's testing us," Mia said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. We all turned to look at her. She was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "It's trying to see what we'll do, how far we'll go." "What are you talking about?" Eric asked, his voice sharp. He was on edge, more so than I'd ever seen him. "Think about it," Mia said, her voice trembling. "It's not just scaring us. It's playing with us. The photo, the laughter, the voice. It could have come inside already if it wanted to. But it's waiting. Watching." "That's insane," Eric said, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Is it?" Mia shot back, her tone biting. "Tell me one thing about this that's normal. Just one." Eric didn't respond. None of us did. The quiet stretched out again, heavy and oppressive. The fire was almost out now, the shadows in the room growing longer and darker. I could feel the tension in the air, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. And then, without warning, the front door slammed open. The sound was deafening in the silence, the force of it sending a gust of cold air rushing through the room. We all screamed, jumping to our feet as the door banged against the wall, the hinges groaning under the strain. Eric raised the fire poker, his hands shaking. But there was nothing there. The doorway was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in darkness. "Close it," Jess said, her voice shrill with panic. Eric rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it, his movements frantic. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, spinning around to face us. Before anyone could answer, the laughter started again. This time, it was louder, harsher, and unmistakably inside the cabin. It echoed off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sound was maddening, like nails scraping against my brain. "It's here," Mia whispered, her face pale. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with the sound. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It was in my head, burrowing deeper with every wheezy chuckle. "Make it stop," Jess screamed, tears streaming down her face. She bolted from the corner, sprinting toward the kitchen in a blur of panic. "Jess, wait!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I took off after her. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced around the corner, barely keeping up with her frantic pace. But as I rounded the doorway to the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. Jess, who had been running at full speed just moments ago, was now standing completely still in the middle of the room. The contrast was jarring. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her shoulders unnaturally slack. The rapid motion that had driven her moments ago was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "Jess," I called, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I took a cautious step closer, the floor creaking under my weight. "Jess, are you okay?" I whispered, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around and run. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and unnaturally slow, like something out of a nightmare. When her face came into view, My stomach dropped. Her lips were pulled into a grotesque grin, stretched too wide, as if her skin couldn't contain it. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, glassy with an unnatural sheen. It was the same expression we had seen in the photo of Ryan, only now it was right in front of me. "Jess?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She burst into laughter, loud and unhinged, making me jump back. "Gotcha," she said, doubling over with amusement. "You should have seen your face." "What the hell, Jess?" I shouted, the adrenaline in my veins turning to irritation. "Are you seriously joking right now?" Eric stormed into the kitchen, gripping the fire poker. "You think this is funny? After everything?" Jess straightened up, still grinning, though her laughter started to wane. "I just needed to lighten the mood," she said. "We're all so tense." "Lighten the mood?" Mia's voice cracked as she appeared in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You think pretending to be... that is funny?" Jess looked down, her smile faltering. "I was just trying to help. I didn't mean to scare you guys that bad." The tension in the room was palpable as we stared at Jess, her earlier expression and behavior still unsettling despite her explanation. As the others argued, Jess seemed to retreat into herself, her grin fading into something almost neutral, though her silence felt heavier than usual. I tried to convince myself she was just embarrassed by the backlash. After all, it was Jess. The morning light trickling through the windows felt like salvation. None of us had managed to sleep, the events of the night leaving us raw and jittery. Jess was unusually quiet but otherwise acted normal, almost too normal, like she was trying to smooth over the tension from the night before. The rest of us didn't bring it up, each of us silently agreeing to focus on getting out of the cabin. "We head for the car," Eric said, gripping the fire poker like a lifeline. "Stay together," Mia added. We packed quickly, grabbing only what we could carry. It wasn't much. The path to the car was about a mile through dense woods, but we couldn't risk staying. The woods were eerily silent as we left the cabin behind. Even the birds seemed to have fled, leaving only the sound of our hurried footsteps crunching over leaves and twigs. Jess walked in front of me, her usual confident stride subdued. Eric led the group, his eyes scanning every shadow, the fire poker ready in his hands. Mia stuck close to my side, clutching a flashlight like it was her only shield. The tension was suffocating, our paranoia the only thing chasing us. The path seemed to stretch endlessly, the dense trees making it impossible to tell how far we'd come. When we finally reached the car, a wave of relief washed over us. Eric fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. Mia and Jess slid into the back seat, their tension palpable as they buckled in. I climbed into the passenger seat next to Eric, my hands shaking as I shut the door behind me. Eric quickly got into the driver's seat, tossing the fire poker onto the floor of the passenger side before starting the engine. The car lurched forward onto the dirt path that would eventually lead us to the main road. For the first hour, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of branches against the car. It felt surreal, like we'd left something behind that was still with us somehow. "Do you think Ryan's still alive?" Jess finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Eric gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw clenching. "I don't know." "What are we going to tell the police?" Mia asked. Her voice trembled, and she glanced at me as if I had the answer. "We'll tell them the truth," I said, though the words felt hollow. That he went missing. That we saw something. Something, Jess echoed, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Do you think they're going to believe we ran from whatever the hell that thing was? Eric sighed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. We'll deal with it when we get to a station. Right now, we just have to get there. The car fell silent again, the weight of Eric's words settling over us. I stared out the window, watching as the trees blurred past, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal hands. My mind kept circling back to Ryan, his laugh, his stupid jokes. The image of him grinning in that haunting photo burned into my memory. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the car shifted from fear to exhaustion. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. Jess fidgeted in her seat, glancing occasionally at the GPS on Eric's phone. "How much longer?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Eric glanced at the screen. "Another hour, maybe more. The map says we'll hit a highway soon." Mia sighed, leaning her head against the window. "I just want this to be over." "We all do," I said, though the words felt meaningless. None of us knew if this nightmare would end when we reached civilization. The golden light of the setting sun slowly gave way to the muted hues of dusk. The forest seemed to change with the fading light, the shadows growing longer, darker, more oppressive. The road narrowed, and the trees pressed closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the remaining light. Eric slowed the car as the GPS directed us to take another turn. The new road was narrower still, the pavement cracked and uneven. The air inside the car grew heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft hum of the engine. It was as night fully descended that the first haunting returned. Without warning, something slammed against the windshield with a deafening thud. We all screamed, the sound ripping from our throats in unison. The smiling figure was suddenly there, its face pressed against the glass, the grotesque grin stretched impossibly wide. Its hollow, dark eyes stared directly at us, unblinking, as if it could see into the very core of our terror. The pale flesh of its face was flattened against the windshield, almost translucent under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "What the hell is that?" Jess shrieked, clutching the sides of her seat. Eric's voice cracked as he yelled, "Hold on!" He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The figure clung to the windshield for a moment longer, its grin never wavering, before it slid off with a sickening scrape. Its body crumpled unnaturally as it hit the ground, but when I turned to look back, it was already standing, its head tilted slightly, that terrible grin still etched across its face as it watched us speed away into the darkness. The car sped down the winding forest road, the oppressive silence inside only broken by the occasional GPS directions. Eric's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and I could see his jaw set in a rigid clench. Every so often, he darted a glance at the rearview mirror, as if expecting the smiling figure to reappear at any moment. Jess sat in the back seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the window. Mia sat beside her, gripping the edge of her seat, her wide eyes darting between the passing trees and the GPS screen on Eric's phone. Neither had spoken since the figure slid off the windshield, and I didn't blame them. My own thoughts were a chaotic mess, and every shadow outside looked like it might leap out and attack us. Finally, Mia broke the silence, her voice trembling. What? What the hell was that thing? No one answered. Jess shifted uncomfortably, pulling her jacket tighter around herself, but said nothing. Eric kept his eyes on the road, his jaw flexing as he worked through his own thoughts. I wasn't sure if I should try to comfort Mia or stay silent, but the words came out before I could stop them. It wasn't human, I said, my voice hollow. Nothing human moves like that. Eric exhaled sharply through his nose, his version of a bitter laugh. No kidding. Do you think it's following us? Jess finally asked, her voice low and edged with fear. I don't know, Eric admitted, but I'm not stopping to find out. The GPS chimed again, its mechanical voice startlingly loud in the quiet car. In 3 miles, turn left. We're not far from the highway, Eric said, his voice strained but steady. Once we're out of the woods, we'll head straight to the police. He paused, glancing in the rearview mirror again. They'll know what to do. Mia scoffed softly. You think the cops are going to believe us? That some thing is out here chasing us? What are we even going to tell them? We tell them the truth, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. We tell them about Ryan, about what happened at the cabin, about that thing. Jess shook her head, letting out a humorless laugh. Yeah, great. Hey, officer, there's a smiling monster in the woods. That'll go over well. We don't have another option, Eric said, his tone final. Unless you want to go back and deal with it yourself. That shut Jess up, and the car fell silent again. Outside, the trees pressed closer, their skeletal branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. The road was barely wide enough for the car now, the cracked pavement littered with fallen leaves and debris. I glanced at the GPS screen. We were still 2 miles from the turn. The tension in the car was suffocating. Every bump in the road, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart jump. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying not to think about the figure. Its hollow eyes and that grotesque grin burned into my memory. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. A sound cut through the silence. A laugh, low and guttural, echoing from somewhere in the forest. It started as a single voice, but it grew, multiplying into a cacophony of horrible, mocking laughter that seemed to come from every direction at once. Do you hear that? Mia whispered, her voice shaking. How could we not? Jess snapped, her face pale. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from inside the car. Eric's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning even whiter. Just ignore it. Keep calm, he muttered, more to himself than to us. Then something dark and fast blitzed past the car. It was just a blur at first, but it circled back, darting so close to the windows that we all flinched. The figure moved too quickly to see clearly, a shadowy presence that seemed to defy logic. It passed over the roof of the car, the sound of its movement a low, whooshing growl. What the hell is that? Jess screamed, pressing herself back against her seat. It's toying with us, Eric said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling. Just hold on. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. We all sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, our eyes darting around as we waited for it to return. But instead of the shadow, The headlights illuminated something else. A massive tree had fallen across the road, its thick trunk blocking our path completely. The jagged ends of its branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, and the bark was splintered as if it had been ripped apart by some immense force. "Did that just fall?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. Eric shook his head. "No, that wasn't an accident." Eric shifted the car into reverse, trying to back away from the tree. But as soon as he touched the gas, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," he muttered, frantically turning the key, but the car wouldn't start. The oppressive silence outside seemed to seep into the car, swallowing every sound except Eric's panicked breaths. "What now?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, Mia pointed toward the tree, her hand trembling. "Look, over there, next to the trunk." All of us turned our heads to where she was pointing, and that's when we saw him. Ryan. He was lying on the ground, just a few feet from the splintered wood. His body was still, his face pale and eerily serene in the glow of the headlights. "Oh my God," I breathed, my stomach churning. "Is he alive?" Eric gritted his teeth. "I'm not leaving him out there." He reached for the door handle, but Mia grabbed his arm. "No, don't go out there." Eric hesitated, his eyes darting between Ryan's body and the dark forest beyond. Finally, he nodded. "We'll check together. No one stays alone." Reluctantly, we opened the doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest around us felt suffocating, the darkness pressing in from every side. The sound of our footsteps on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud as we approached Ryan. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. When we reached him, it was clear something was wrong. His body looked intact, no visible wounds or blood, but his eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. His face was frozen in a strange expression, a wide, unnatural grin that made my skin crawl. "Ryan?" Eric called softly, kneeling beside him. He reached out to shake his shoulder, but Ryan didn't move. He's cold." Jess backed away, her hands covering her mouth. "We need to get back in the car. Now." Eric looked at her, then at Ryan again. Something in his expression shifted, and he stood abruptly. "She's right. Let's go." We hurried back to the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. Eric tried the engine again, but it wouldn't turn over. "Damn it," he hissed, hitting the steering wheel. "Just lock the doors," I said, my voice shaking. "We'll figure it out." Eric clicked the locks, and we all sat in silence, the weight of what we'd seen settling over us like a suffocating blanket. The headlights still illuminated Ryan's lifeless body by the tree, his grin visible even from inside the car. None of us spoke. None of us dared to move. My chest tightened, and I glanced at the others. None of us wanted to say it, but we all knew the truth. The silence in the car was oppressive, every second stretching into eternity. The headlights illuminated Ryan's body near the fallen tree, his eerily serene grin visible even from this distance. None of us spoke. None of us dared to. It was as if we were waiting, not for something to happen, but for something to end. Then the laughter started. It was faint at first, just a low chuckle. Jess stiffened in her seat, her hands gripping her arms tightly. "You hear that?" she whispered. We all nodded, no one daring to speak. The laughter grew louder, a chilling symphony of mockery that filled the car, its source impossible to pinpoint. It was low and guttural, then high-pitched and hysterical, as if dozens of voices were joining in. The sound wrapped around us, pressing in on all sides, drilling into our ears until it became unbearable. "Make it stop," Mia whimpered, covering her ears. "Please, make it stop." Eric slammed his hands on the steering wheel. "Damn it, what do you want?" he shouted into the void. But the laughter only grew louder, drowning out his voice, consuming every inch of space in the car. The sound was too much. My chest tightened, and I could feel the walls of my mind cracking under the pressure. "We have to get out," I gasped. "We can't stay in here." Eric hesitated, his eyes darting to the dead engine, then back to us. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but stay together. No one wanders off." We unlocked the doors and stepped out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to clear the suffocating weight of the laughter that still rang in my ears. Outside, the sound was even more overwhelming, as if the entire forest was laughing at us. I turned toward the tree, expecting to see Ryan's body lying where we had last seen it, but it was gone. "Where is he?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. She pointed to the spot where Ryan had been, now just an empty patch of ground. "He was right there," Eric said, his tone disbelieving. "I saw him. We all saw him." Mia took a shaky step closer to the tree, her eyes scanning the area. "Ryan," she called out softly, her voice swallowed by the cacophony of laughter. "Don't," I warned, grabbing her arm. "Stay close." We huddled together, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The forest seemed alive with shadows, shifting and twisting in the dim light of the headlights. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees felt like it could be him. Or worse, that thing. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible over the laughter. "We get back in the car," Eric said firmly. "We lock the doors, and we wait it out. Whatever this is, it can't last forever." None of us argued. We retreated to the car as quickly as we could, locking the doors behind us. The laughter persisted, but inside the car it was slightly muffled. Still, it was enough to set my nerves on edge, each peal of laughter a dagger to my sanity. "He was right there," Jess muttered, rocking slightly in her seat. "He was right there. And now he's gone." Eric didn't respond. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. Mia stared out the window, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to see into the darkness. And me? I just sat there, staring straight ahead, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't begin to articulate. The laughter still echoed in my ears, but now it was joined by a new sound. The faint rustling of something moving outside the car. None of us spoke. None of us dared to move. The oppressive silence after the laughter faded was somehow worse. It left us all on edge, as if the sound had been the only thing keeping something worse at bay. Jess hugged her knees to her chest in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the window. Mia sat stiffly beside her, her hand gripping the edge of the seat so tightly her knuckles were white. Eric hadn't moved from his position at the wheel, though his hands now rested limply in his lap. "We need to call someone," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric nodded without looking at her. I'll call the police. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. When he spoke, his voice was firm but strained. Hello? Yes, we need help. We're on a forest road near the old campsite off Route 19. One of our friends is missing, and we're stranded. There's something out here. Please send someone quickly. The dispatcher's voice was calm, asking for details. Eric answered as best as he could, his gaze darting nervously between the dead engine and the darkness outside. When he hung up, he let out a shaky breath. They're sending someone. We just have to wait. Jess let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked any humor. Wait? For what? For that thing to come back? For help, I said, though the word felt hollow. Eric looked back at us, his eyes dark with exhaustion. We stay in the car. We keep the doors locked. Whatever this is, it's safer here than out there. And what do we tell them when they get here? Jess asked, her voice rising slightly. Do we tell them about Ryan? About that thing? They're going to think we're crazy. We tell them the truth, Mia said firmly. All of it. Let them think we're crazy. At least we'll be out of here. Jess shook her head, but didn't argue further. The tension in the car was thick enough to choke on. None of us wanted to admit it, but the thought of seeing Ryan's body again, or worse, not seeing it at all, was gnawing at us. What do you think happened to him? I asked softly, breaking the heavy silence. No one answered at first. Then Eric said, I don't know. Maybe he got up and walked away. Walked away? Jess's voice cracked. After lying there like that, with that grin on his face? Are you hearing yourself? Do you have a better explanation? Eric snapped, his frustration bubbling over. Because I'm all ears. Mia's gaze was distant, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it's like a trick. Like that thing is trying to mess with us. Her words sent a chill down my spine. The thought had crossed my mind, but hearing it said aloud made it feel real. Too real. Time dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves outside felt like it could be the start of something terrible. The laughter was gone, but the oppressive weight of the night pressed down on us, suffocating and inescapable. Finally, after what felt like hours, a faint light appeared in the distance. Headlights. Relief washed over me so suddenly I felt tears prick my eyes. They're here, I whispered. The police car pulled up slowly, its lights cutting through the darkness. 2 officers stepped out, their flashlights sweeping the area as they approached. One of them tapped on the driver's side window, and Eric rolled it down just enough to speak. We got your call, the officer said, his tone professional but wary. Are you all right? We're alive, Eric replied, but something's out here, and our friend, he was lying right there. He pointed toward the tree, but now he's gone. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. Stay in the car, one of them said. We'll check it out. We watched as they moved toward the tree, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The night had grown eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My stomach churned with dread as I realized we were no closer to understanding what was happening. The morning sun was just starting to rise when the police finally led us away from the scene. None of us had slept. We were all bundled into separate squad cars, the officers exchanging clipped conversations on their radios. I could hear Jess's soft crying from the car ahead of me. Eric sat in silence beside the officer driving, his face pale and unreadable. Mia was in the car behind, her hands visible through the rear windshield as she clutched her knees to her chest. At the station, they separated us into different rooms. Each of us was questioned individually. The officer sitting across from me seemed calm, his voice low and even as he started. "So, can you walk me through what happened?" he asked, clicking his pen. I tried to explain. About Ryan, about the laughter, about the thing we saw. But every time the words left my mouth, they felt absurd, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The officer listened, his pen scratching against his notebook. When I mentioned the smiling figure, he paused. "You're sure you saw this person?" I nodded. We all did. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. He exchanged a glance with the officer at the door. "And Ryan? You said you saw his body near the tree?" "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "He was there. We all saw him. But when we got out of the car, he was gone." The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We didn't find any signs of a body, but we did find this." He reached into a folder and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was Ryan's phone. My stomach dropped as I recognized it. The screen was cracked, but it still displayed the last photo in his gallery. Ryan's grinning face, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "This was found near the tree," the officer continued. "Does this mean anything to you?" I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "I don't know." They didn't push further. After what felt like hours, they let us go. We regrouped in the station's lobby, each of us looking more drained than the last. Jess had dark circles under her eyes, and Mia's hands were still trembling. Eric leaned against the wall, staring at the floor as if it might offer answers. "They didn't find him," Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could they not find him?" "Because he's not there anymore," Mia replied, her voice breaking. "I don't know where he is, but he's not there." Eric finally looked up, his jaw tight. "We're going home, all of us, separately. We're done with this." "Done with what?" Jess snapped. "Ryan's gone, Eric. He's gone, and we don't even know why." Eric's voice was low but firm. "I don't care. Whatever this is, I'm not letting it follow me. I suggest you all do the same." The room fell into a heavy silence. None of us wanted to admit it, but he was right. Whatever had happened, it wasn't over, and it wouldn't be, not for a long time. We didn't say much after that. Eric left first, his shoulders rigid as he walked out the door. Mia went next, offering a weak, apologetic smile before disappearing into the morning light. Jess lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on me. "Do you think he's still alive?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know." She nodded, as if that was the answer she expected. Then she turned and left, leaving me alone in the station's empty lobby. Eventually, I forced myself to leave as well. The streets were quiet as I made my way home, the morning sun doing little to dispel the oppressive weight that hung over me. My house, once a sanctuary, now felt cold and unfamiliar as I stepped inside. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The events of the past day replayed in my mind, a relentless loop that refused to let me rest. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe again. Not really. Whatever we had encountered in those woods, it wasn't finished with us. I could feel it, lingering just out of sight, waiting. And I had no idea what to do next. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the floor, trying to piece together everything that had happened. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. All I knew for sure was that we'd gone into those woods with 5 people, and we'd come out with 4. Ryan's phone still had that photo, that awful, impossible photo. The events of the past few days were like a splinter in my mind. No matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the images of Ryan's face, the laughter, and that awful smile kept resurfacing. Needing to make sense of it, I decided to call a few friends I trusted outside our group. Maybe talking it out would help. I spoke to Sarah first, a childhood friend who had always been level-headed. As I stumbled through my story, I could feel her hesitance over the phone. "That's intense," Sarah said finally, her voice cautious. "Are you sure it's not just your mind playing tricks on you? Trauma can do that." "It's not trauma," I said, almost pleading. "We all saw it, Sarah. All of us. And now Ryan's gone." She didn't argue further, but her silence said enough. I ended the call shortly after, feeling more alone than before. My next attempt was with Mark, a friend from college. His reaction was more direct. "Sounds like you guys freaked yourselves out," he said bluntly. "You've been through something terrible, yeah, but don't let your imagination make it worse." I wanted to scream, to force them to understand, but their reactions only reinforced how isolated I felt. Eventually, I gave up and turned to the group chat. "Hey, how is everyone doing? Did you all make it home okay?" I stared at the screen, waiting for any sign of life. Minutes turned into hours. The only response came from Jess. "I'm okay. Just trying to process everything." Her reply did little to ease my growing unease. No one else even read the message. Still, the silence was deafening. By the time dusk fell, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. At around 8 p.m., I decided to try sleeping. Maybe rest would quiet my thoughts. But sleep didn't come. I tossed and turned, my mind a relentless storm of questions and fears. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone to check the chat again. Jess's response was still the only activity. I tried calling Mia. No answer. Then Eric. Nothing. Even Jess didn't pick up. A knock at the door made me jump. The sound was sharp, deliberate. I froze, staring at the door. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Hey, it's me," a voice called. It sounded exactly like Mia. Relief flooded me. I stumbled to the door, fumbling with the lock, and opened it. But when I did, I stopped cold. It wasn't Mia. It was Jess. "Jess?" I said, my voice tinged with confusion. "I thought, you can't sleep either, huh?" She interrupted, her voice casual and light. It sounded normal, like the Jess I knew. Before I could say anything else, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I turned to close the door, still trying to process what was happening. When I turned back around, Jess was standing in the middle of the room. Her back was to me, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Jess?" I called softly, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Her stillness was unnerving, the air in the room thick with tension. Slowly she turned around. Her face was twisted into that same grotesque smile she had worn in the kitchen. It was too wide, too hollow. Her eyes empty of recognition. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, every instinct screaming at me to run. My mind raced, pieces falling into place. The photo on Ryan's phone, the grin, the way Jess had acted in the kitchen. The realization hit me like a freight train. Her grin widened, stretching impossibly far. She didn't confirm or deny it, but her expression said enough. Panic surged through me as the horrifying truth dawned. The others were gone because of her, because of that thing. Eric, Mia, they hadn't just disappeared. They were dead. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I felt it deep in my bones. Jess, or whatever was pretending to be her, had killed them. And now it was my turn. The room seemed to darken as she took another step forward. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening with fear. Her grin consumed my vision, stretching wider and wider until it was all I could see. And then, it all became clear to me.